Sponsored in part by Cinequip, our gear, your vision. And McKay Transcold, operating the Transcold Express train between California and the Midwest. Perhaps the easiest thing to say about John F. Kennedy was that he was a man of many contradictions. An unlikely survivor from birth, he managed not only to survive, but to succeed and thrive at the very highest levels of society. As president, he projected an image of youthful vigor and swagger, while at least physically, the truth was anything but. His reckless and oftentimes destructive personal behavior stood in sharp contrast to the carefully manicured image projected from the White House of a doting father and devout family man. In politics, his passion and preference were unquestionably for matters of foreign affairs. Yet his greatest triumph may have been his call for sacrifice and service at home. And though the tangible achievements of his administration may have been minimal, the myth and memory that is John F. Kennedy and the world of Camelot remains unparalleled. In this 8-part documentary, we will cover John F. Kennedy's life from barely surviving birth to the tragic events in Dallas on November 22, 1963. We will highlight the major turning points, including his early years, military life, and becoming a congressman and senator, up through the 1960 presidential race against Richard Nixon. We will detail the short 2 years and 10 months he served as president, from his inspirational inauguration speech asking not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, up through his final days in Dallas and all points in between. Finally, we'll take a look at John F. Kennedy's legacy through the present day and beyond. In the course of the journey, we hope to present a clear and concise portrait of the man and the myth that helped shape a new world order.
The Kennedy presidency is such a brief but fully loaded of event. I mean, in such a short span of time, to have to contend with so many unanticipated big things lends a dimension to that few presidents share. I mean, on top of the fact that it's a presidency so largely on film, made by film, captured on film. His rise and the role of the camera, and his death and the role of the camera. I mean, there's, like bookends to his presidency.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, called Johnny by his father, but better known as Jack to the rest of the family and friends, was born at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, May 29, 1917, the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald. His maternal grandfather, John F. Fitzgerald, was the first Irish-American mayor of Boston, who served 3 terms between 1906 and 1914. Jack's paternal grandfather, Patrick J. Kennedy, was a successful liquor importer who held significant interest in the coal and banking industries. From the very beginning, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's world was one of wealth and privilege, advantages that would serve him well both socially and politically throughout his life. Rose and Joe had married in 1914 and, breaking from tradition, bought a home in the mostly Protestant community of Brookline, Massachusetts. With the Kennedy family life firmly centered around Joe Sr.'s seemingly insatiable drive and ambition, Jack's mother, Rose, oftentimes found herself overwhelmed with the burden of raising a young and soon-to-be very large family on her own. For the first 17 years of the marriage, Rose was either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. To escape her unhappy home life, Rose traveled extensively around America and Europe, leaving the children to be raised mostly by servants and relatives.
I think it would be a big challenge to grow up in the Kennedy family with a father as dominant and as directing as the Kennedy patriarch. And the dynamic among the children and the rivalries among the children would be a real challenge to grow up into. The expectations were high. And for John, whose physical frame was hardly strong and virile, just the opposite of what most people think about, it was particularly challenging. He was a weaker person. And he looked up, of course, to his older brother, who was a hero in a World War II, and to achieve the same sort of ability as his older brother was a tough thing from his father's perspective.
Much of Jack's youth was spent in the shadow of his older brother, Joe Jr. Jack and his brother's relationship was marked by a good-natured but intense competitiveness, with Jack hoping to set himself apart from his high-achieving brother and make a name for himself on his own. But when Joe Jr. was killed in a secret bombing mission over Germany in August of 1944, Jack did not hesitate to pick up the political torch from his late brother. A few years later, in the spring of 1948, Jack was once again visited by tragedy when his closest sibling, his sister Kathleen, was killed in a plane crash en route to France when her plane struck the side of a mountain. Jack had discovered an interest in politics in 1937 after his freshman year at Harvard, when he and his best friend, Lem Billings, along with Jack's prized Ford sedan convertible with fold-down top, sailed for Europe. The 10 weeks spent driving around the continent would help spark an ambitious and serious political education that would last a lifetime.
Well, there's always a kind of a curious paradox here, or a contradiction, because Joe Kennedy is an isolationist when it comes as a diplomat into World War II, but he's a staunch interventionist when it comes to his children and the careers of his children. I mean, he takes a direct and active interest in all of their activities, directing them. And I think for John especially, he felt both the pull of that and also wanted to resist that a little bit, as you'll see in his career when he becomes more of an interventionist. And that's in large part, of course, due to his travels in the 30s in Europe and seeing what was happening with the fascist rise in Hitler Germany and fascist Italy and all of that. So, and the response in the Western democracies of what would later be called appeasement or enabling the rise of these countries and these totalitarian regimes. That was something John Kennedy would see as very alarming.
When Jack returned to Harvard, based on his experiences in Europe, he wrote his senior thesis, Appeasement in Munich. In it, he argued that England was unprepared for Hitler's advances. With the help and encouragement of family friend and New York Times columnist Arthur Kroc, Appeasement in Munich was revised and released in book form, retitled Why England Slept. The book was widely read, and most significantly, was a direct departure from his famous father's isolationist views. Joe Sr. had been made ambassador to the United Kingdom by Roosevelt in 1940, but because of his strong isolationist views, after the Battle of Britain, was relieved of the position. A few years later, when Joe Jr. was killed over Germany in a secret bombing mission, Joseph Kennedy would blame his son's death on what he felt was Roosevelt's march to war.
He had to exhibit strength and a commitment to duty for the United States, a very patriotic individual. And it was absolutely incredible. It was absolutely essential that he participate in this conflict, that other Harvard people and other Ivy League people and other people of his class would be expected to do. And he had to absolutely follow suit with that. Regardless even of what his personal ambitions might be. I mean, it was part of that social element that he participated in and had to follow suit.
John Kennedy felt it was his duty to join the war effort. But because of chronic health issues, he failed to pass the required physical examination from both the Army and the Navy. It took Joe Sr. arranging for the re-administration of the Navy physical for him to finally pass. Jack's father expected his son to be tucked away, stationed in some remote corner of the war, far from harm's way. But Jack had no intention of shirking his duty. He was determined to fight, and in the spring of 1943 took command of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat operating in the hotly contested Solomon Islands. In the morning hours of August 2, 1943, on a mission to torpedo a Japanese fleet attempting to escape the U.S. Navy, Jack's boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer, cutting the PT boat in half. 2 of Jack's men were killed instantly, and along with the rest of his crew, Jack was left clinging to the hull of the PT boat, surrounded by oil flames. Swimming for more than 5 hours, leading his crew, Jack managed to drag a badly injured sailor by his life vest until they finally reached the closest island. As the story goes, Jack carved their location on a coconut shell and gave it to native islanders, who agreed to take the shell to Rendova, the PT's main base. The islanders returned the next day with a note from a New Zealand lieutenant stationed on New Georgia. And a day later, the 7th day of their ordeal, Jack left with the natives by canoe for New Georgia. After the war, John Kennedy had the coconut shell shellacked in heavy plastic. The shell was kept on the corner of his desk so he could keep it as a permanent memento of the ordeal. With a nudge from Joe Sr., the tale of Jack's heroism made an immediate splash in the newspapers, doing much to shape Jack's future image. When asked how he became a war hero, Jack joked, "It was easy. They cut my boat in half."
The PT-109 experience for John Kennedy is going to be absolutely critical for his political life. At the time, and much so even later, when Hollywood will, of course, make the movie, and what president or even candidate for president wouldn't want Hollywood to make a blockbuster film about an incident in your life in the war, and then have one of the leading, actors of the day, Cliff Robertson, play the leading role. I mean, this is, you can't buy that kind of, of celebrity. And it's going to play tremendously into Kennedy's political career, image-wise, a hero, a wounded veteran, courageous to the very end, caring for his men. That will play very well when he campaigns politically for the presidency. So even at the time and then later, that really encourages and advances his image as a youthful, strong, brave individual.
In 1944, Joe Sr. offered to help Congressman James Michael Curley, the former mayor of Boston, with his legal and financial troubles, in exchange for Curley vacating his seat in the House of Representatives. Curley agreed, and 29-year-old John F. Kennedy won the seat in 1946.
There's little doubt that John Kennedy's chances of success in politics in Massachusetts depended entirely on his father. I mean, we're still talking about the legacy of Catholics in Massachusetts. I mean, it's a Protestant realm. They're still dealing with that legacy of prejudice. They're dealing with the fact that it's going to cost a fortune, and John Kennedy's going to have a available bank account, and Joe Kennedy's going to make sure that people know about his son, and he's going to pay a lot of money to have people say good things and to even step away from political office in order for his son to take their place. So the father is going to be very dominant in all aspects of his son's campaign. And it's going to be very important, especially because John Kennedy's just not a natural campaigner. He is not an extroverted, outgoing, populist type of figure. I mean, he's not a Tammany Hall type politician. He's reserved. He's cautious. He's kind of a quieter individual. And to have him go out shaking hands, meeting people he wouldn't ordinarily meet on a daily basis was really difficult for him. And he's going to need a lot of training and support and encouragement from his father and others.
Jack, at least initially, was not well suited for political life. He was not yet an effective public speaker, with audiences finding him awkward, stiff, and insecure. When he mingled with voters, which he was reluctant to do, he seemed aloof and uncomfortable. He was careless with his schedule, and audiences were often left waiting an hour or more. When asked why he was running for office, he often said that he was taking over for his brother Joe.
He's not going into politics as a rabble-rouser to make enormous changes in things. He's going into politics because it's expected of him. And quite frankly, I think he sees who's in politics and he looks at them as sort of inferior beings. And if they're doing it, why aren't I doing it? I mean, his sense of self, his intelligence, his social class. I actually think he was compelled in many ways just because of the low quality of what he saw as his competition. And if they can do it, he could certainly do it and do it better. The problem was getting there. I mean, the fuss and bother of going through all of the politics of obtaining a seat.
6 years later, in Jack's run for Senate, Joe Sr. would again step in, this time firing one of Jack's most trusted aides and replacing him with Jack's younger brother Bobby. When Joe Sr. found out that the influential Boston Post was going to come out in favor of Jack's opponent, Henry Cabot Lodge, Joe Sr. met with the publisher John Fox and managed to change his mind. Shortly after the meeting, the financially strapped publisher received a $500,000 loan from Jack's father. Jack paid little attention to how the campaign was financed. He never asked where the money came from or how it was spent, and he continued to use his family as a well-heeled sideshow attraction for his appearances. It was during this period that Jack would be introduced to his future wife, Jacqueline Bouvier. The couple were married on September 12, 1953, 1 year after Jack was elected senator. 4 years later, in 1957, after enduring a miscarriage and a stillbirth, the couple gave birth to their first child, Caroline.
Having obtained those seats, he's not going to take a leading role. He's not going to be an active figure, it's largely, to make a step for other offices and greater ambition. But he's not really working that hard. He likes and appreciates and feels he deserves the recognition of political office. But that office doesn't mean he has to work all that hard.
Kennedy served 2 terms as senator, mostly without distinction. Though in 1956, while serving on the Select Committee on Labor, Kennedy took a strong stand against corruption and racketeering within the Teamsters Union. Jack's brother Bobby, who served as the committee's chief counsel, had discovered several financial irregularities within the union, including Teamster Vice President Jimmy Hoffa taking $85,000 from union funds to pay for personal bills. The investigations were televised, and Jack's aggressive questioning turned him into a national political figure.
Well, the fact is, though, that you were paying them a bribe then.
I was paying him a bribe. I paid it with the complete knowledge of the United States
I'm
government.
not talking now about that. I'm talking about your own responsibility. You know that that's prohibited by law for you to pay a bribe.
Well, there's no bribe as far as I was concerned.
We're talking about the fact that you gave $175 a week in cash to Mr. McHugh, and it was your impression at the time you were giving it that it was going into his pocket. Now, isn't that correct?
No, it was not my impression it was going in his pocket. He advised it is for the needy union men and
Yes,
friends.
but you've already testified that at first you believed him and that then you didn't. Isn't that correct?
Later on, I was, from various statements they said and what I heard at Tobahanna, I was of the opinion that probably they were lying to me.
Often absent from the Senate while undergoing several spine operations, it was during one of these convalescences that John Kennedy found time to write Profiles in Courage. The book profiles senators who risked their careers for their beliefs and would eventually give him the distinction of being the only American president to win the Pulitzer Prize. Though, as with many of his early accolades, the prize was not without controversy. The book was never proposed by the Pulitzer Board as a candidate for the Biography Prize, and only became nominated after much lobbying from Arthur Kroc, the family friend and columnist who had helped push Why England Slept into the spotlight 15 years earlier. It was also revealed in Ted Sorensen's 2008 memoir that Sorensen had helped co-write the book.
John Kennedy of Massachusetts is an outstanding American. John Kennedy of Massachusetts is a great Democrat. John Kennedy of Massachusetts is a successful campaigner and a successful candidate every time he has run for public office. The convention will be in order.
In 1956, at the Democratic Convention, Jack Kennedy took one step closer to center stage when he came in second to Estes Kefauver as the party's nominee to be Adlai Stevenson's running mate.
Mr. Chairman, Tennessee respectfully requests the opportunity for candidate Albert Gore to make a brief announcement. Mr. Chairman, with thanks to this great free Democratic convention, I request that my name be withdrawn in favor of my colleague, Senator Estes Kefauver.
Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Ladies and gentlemen of this convention, I want to take this opportunity first to express my appreciation to Democrats from all parts of the country, north and south, east and west, who have been so generous and kind to me this afternoon. I think that it proves, as nothing else could prove, what a strong and united party the Democratic Party is. Secondly, I think what has happened today bears out the good judgment of Governor Stevenson in deciding that this issue should be taken to the floor of the convention. because I believe that the Democratic Party will go from this convention far stronger for what we have done here today. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, recognizing that this convention has selected a man who has campaigned in all parts of the country, who has worked entirely for the party, who will serve as an admirable running mate to Governor Stevenson, I hope that this convention will make F.D. Kefauver's nomination unanimous. Thank you.
It was shortly after the 1956 election that, with enthusiastic support from his family, Jack privately decided to run for president.
You know, when discussing the Kennedy campaign for presidency and the role of television, and you usually hear about the debates, of course. But another way of looking at the value of the use of television to promote his candidacy is, you know, one I will remember just as a little boy. I mean, I'm living up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is hardly the mainstream of campaign row. And yet John Kennedy came to Duluth, Minnesota in 1960. And I knew enough about that and knew he was coming, and my mother, my brothers, and we all stood by the road and, you know, watched the caravan of cars go by. So I was aware in Duluth, Minnesota, as a little kid, of this person running for the presidency. And we even we developed a jingle, I remember, as a 5-year-old, where we would just sort of sing, you know, Kennedy, Kennedy is our man. Nixon belongs in the garbage can, which is great 5-year-old stuff. But even as a kid, I mean, a little kid, that's kind of interesting to have a kind of political awareness that had to have come, just must have come from TV.
It started in July when the Democratic Party nominated Senator John F. Kennedy for President of the United States, and for Vice President, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. The party united behind its candidates. Richard M. Nixon was the choice of the Republican Party. He had served as Vice President of the United States since 1953. Now he was a candidate for the presidency. His vice presidential running mate, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge.
In the mid-50s, there's no question that for John Kennedy, what's going to be so much of his appeal is his youth. It's going to be the same thing for Richard Nixon. I mean, these are young men who have, you know, represented this new generation coming out of World War II, and they're young. Nixon represents a certain kind of that young population. John Kennedy represents another flavor of that young generation. But the youth, the energy, the appearance of John Kennedy is going to have a tremendous impact, especially when you compare it, I mean, to the people that have been running the show. I mean, these are all older individuals. Dwight Eisenhower, very respected, older man. These are elderly individuals. This is a new generation, and John Kennedy is the face of that in so many ways. It's difficult for people nowadays to appreciate how primitive television was in 1960. It is a new medium. There aren't many channels. It goes off the air. Nightly news would be 15 minutes. I mean, it is an entirely different scenario. People are not that in tune to televisions. It's not part of their lives on a regular basis. There's just not much TV. But this is going to be the first election where we're going to start seeing more coverage. And part of that's going to stem from who we're dealing with, John Kennedy. He looks good on television. He's made for TV. And he's quite aware of that. Richard Nixon, even though he's in the same age group, is kind of an older, younger man. And he still sort of subscribes to sort of older, non-TV views. For example, he's much more of a sincerity politician. People will see that I'm sincere. People will recognize I mean what I'm saying, and I am very devoted. And John Kennedy, yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean he's not devoted or he's less sincere, but he understands the medium better. It is one that appeals to looks and to style. And John Kennedy was preeminently stylish.
And I was a Republican back then. And I think maybe the party changed later, so I'm okay with that, but still. So I get this scholarship to go to Eagleton Institute of Practical Politics at Rutgers University and to study political science and practical stuff. And I'm so excited. And I get there, and there are 5 of us who are fellows, 4 Democrats and me. And it turns out, of course, that I have to defend Richard Nixon against John Kennedy in the election. And as the thing goes on, this becomes more and more difficult.
A lot of what we know today about Kennedy's opposition within the Democratic Party in the late 50s, early 60s was little known at the time. I mean, those are the kinds of old-time politics where you talk in the hallways or in the hotel rooms, or the houses of prominent people. But there's always been in the Democratic and in the Republican Party wings and flanks, and tend to be people more politically conservative or culturally liberal or economically liberal or whatever. A lot of the institutional Democrats, people from the 30s and 40s, the older school, they didn't look very favorably on John Kennedy. Many of them just saw him as kind of a pretty boy, who was just kind of wanting political office to, advance his status. And they didn't really see any track record that they respected. They didn't see any initiative on his part. And quite frankly, some of the things they saw in his congressional career offended them. His relationship with Senator McCarthy and his, very prominent opposition to communism, and not enough initiative with more liberal policies, the kinds of things that Eleanor Roosevelt made a career out of. So there's that famous snub when Eleanor Roosevelt commented on John Kennedy's book, Profile and Courage. She said, too much profile and not enough courage. I mean, that was a real stinging rebuke that was shared by many of her generation. And John had to kind of deal with that and work around that and get their support. I don't know that he ever really fully got it, but, he is a winner, and he would carry the Democratic banner nonetheless.
I suggested that if the United States felt that it could save the summit conference, that it would have been proper for us to have expressed regret. In my judgment, that statement had been distorted by Mr. Nixon and others in their debates around the country and in their discussions. Mr. Lodge on Meet the Press a month ago said if there was ever a case when we did not have law on our side, it was in the U-2 incident. The U-2 flights were proper from the point of view of protecting our security, but they were not in accordance with international law. And I said that I felt that rather than tell the lie which we told, rather than indicate that the flights would continue, in fact, I believe Mr. Nixon himself said on May 15th that the flights would continue, even though Mr. Herter testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that they had been canceled as of May 12th. But it would have been far better that if we had expressed regret, if that would have saved the summit, and if the summit is useful, and I believe it is. The point that is always left out is the fact that we expressed regrets to Castro this winter, that we expressed regrets to the Eisenhower administration, expressed regrets for a flight over southern Russia in 1958. The Soviet Union in 1955 expressed regrets to us over the Bering Sea incident. The Chinese communists expressed regrets to us over a plane incident in 1956. That is the accepted procedure between nations. And my judgment is that we should follow the advice of Theodore Roosevelt. Be strong, maintain a strong position, but also speak softly. I believe that in those cases where international custom calls for the expression of a regret, if that would have kept the summit going, in my judgment, it was a proper action. It's not appeasement. It's not soft. I believe we should be stronger than we now are. I believe we should have a stronger military force. I believe we should increase our strength all over the world. But I don't confuse words with strength. In my judgment, if the summit was useful, if it would have brought us closer to peace, but rather than the lie that we told, which has been criticized by all responsible people afterwards, it would have been far better for us to follow the common diplomatic procedure of expressing regret and then try to move on.
You know, looking back on it today, what wasn't known at the time was much of that appearance was the derivative of medicine that he was taking that helped him have a tan, that gave him more flesh on his bones, that made him look more fit. On the other hand, too, I mean, we can't forget that Nixon was not well at the time he had been in the hospital. He wasn't particularly healthy at the time. He refused the kinds of things people said he should use, like more cosmetics. He didn't want that, and, you know, he didn't look the part. So television is going to be a new feature this time around.
I think if the president is responsible, if he consults with those involved, if he makes it clear that the Supreme Court decision is going to be carried out in a way that the Supreme Court planned, with deliberate speed, then in my judgment, providing he's behind action, I believe we can make progress.
And I'll never forget the first debate when, you know, the famous Nixon looked terrible, Kennedy looked wonderful.
Now, Mr. Herter, in 1958, when he was Under Secretary of State, said they were strategically undefensible. Admiral Struance and Collins in 1955 said that we should not attempt to defend these islands in their conference in the Far East.
And, you know, the standard story, of course, and I don't know if there's any real empirical proof to back this up, but the standard idea is that, you know, if you listen to the debates, Nixon seemed to win on points. He seemed to be the stronger debater. And look, Nixon had lots of experience with that in college and from law school and whatnot. But if you saw it, you know, the image was greater for John Kennedy. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it seems to be the case.
I mean, I was really heavily involved in politics. I was a Republican delegate to the state convention before I was old enough to vote. I mean, I looked old. I always looked old. And nobody thought to ask me if I was old. So I just went ahead and did it, even though it was against the rules. So, I mean, I was in it. I ran for the legislature in '64, and it was, so, yeah, boy, I understood that I was on the tough side in that election, you know, to actually have to support Nixon when all this excitement is coming in on the other side. Wow, it was just really hard.
Many thought Kennedy was too young, including ex-President Harry S. Truman, who stated this belief publicly. Lyndon Johnson, along with Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson, the most likely Democratic presidential candidate that year, raised the question of Kennedy's health, a subject Kennedy was determined to keep hidden if he was to have any chance of occupying the White House. Only a week before the convention, Harry Truman complained that the convention was fixed and announced that he would give up his seat in the Missouri delegation as a result. He accused Kennedy of buying the nomination and of improperly pressuring delegates.
It's always a challenge for people to think historically. And it's just too easy to project now into the past and to think that what currently occurs, or the attitudes or the climate of opinion was the same or similar, 20, 30 years ago. But 30 years is a long time. It's a generation. It's difficult for Americans today to realize the kind of division that was evident between Catholics and Protestants. And it's an age-old one in the United States for Catholics, a prejudice about the Pope, the prejudice about a foreign, Latin church in this country, and the suspicion or fear that if you're a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, that somehow you're going to be an agent for what the Pope would say. And that was a remarkable challenge that Kennedy had to confront and deal with. And there are many people you talk to who lived during that time who are embarrassed to admit that they may have voted against Kennedy because of his Catholicism, and just fearful of that. I mean, we'd only had really one individual before run as a Catholic, and it's a tough one.
In a 1958 television interview, Eleanor Roosevelt accused Kennedy's father of having a paid representative in every state. And a few months later, touching on Kennedy's most vulnerable subject politically, his Catholicism, Roosevelt questioned Jack's ability to separate church from state. Kennedy confronted the sensitive issue of his Catholicism head-on at a September 1960 speech delivered to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association.
Do not judge me on the basis of these pamphlets and publications. We have all seen that carefully select quotations out of context from the statements of Catholic Church leaders, usually in other countries, frequently in other centuries, and rarely relevant to any situation here, and always omitting, of course, the statement of the American bishops in 1948, which strongly endorsed church-state separation, and which more nearly reflects the views of almost every American Catholic. I do not consider these other quotations binding upon my public acts. Why should you?
He's just not ready. He's too, he doesn't have the experience. He's too young. He's too, and he's Catholic, which was not a good thing in those days.
But let me say, with respect to other countries, that I am wholly opposed to the state being used by any religious group, Catholic or Protestant, to compel, prohibit, or prosecute the free exercise of any other religion. And that goes for any persecution at any time by anyone in any country. And I hope that you and I condemn with equal fervor those nations which deny their presidency to Protestants and those which deny it to Catholics. And rather than cite the misdeeds of those who differ, I would also cite the record of the Catholic Church in such nations as France and Ireland, and the independence of such statesmen as de Gaulle and Adenauer. But let me stress again that these are my views. For contrary to common newspaper usage, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me.
The speech did much to allay the fears of a predominantly Protestant country. The rest of his campaign focused mostly on the perceived missile gap between the U.S. and Soviets, as well as the pressing domestic issues of the day, with an emphasis on getting the country moving again and connecting to the New Deal legacy to appease the liberals who had questioned his commitment. Election Day 1960 would start out with the two anxious candidates casting their votes. Vice President Nixon and his wife Pat in their hometown of Whittier, California. John and Jackie, while mobbed by photographers in Jack's hometown of Boston. Across the country, Americans showed up at the polls to vote for what would be destined to be a very tight race.
We get then to close to election night, and the people at Rutgers and at Eagleton got a connection with NBC News. And so all of us were allowed to go to NBC News on election night and to watch the election returns come in and participate in the coverage.
As with the debates, this would be the first election coverage where television would play a central role. The major networks competed to see who could present the most elaborate and, for the day, sophisticated methods and machines for tabulating results. Vast sets, full of bustling, busy people, were erected on sound stages that, within a few short years, would come to be the rule of the day.
There was a guy who was controversial head of NBC News. His name was Elmer Lauer. Really tiny guy. And all of us who are at Eagleton were kind of standing together, getting ready for the big night. And these doors burst open in this huge Studio 5. And then here comes Mr. Lauer and like 15 vice presidents or something in this phalanx. And all of us, we've read about this. We've heard about big business, but we didn't know. We never saw it before. They come stomping in. They all get together and they help him up on a table. And he gives a speech about how this is really important, and we got to do the best job possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he ended with a line I'll never forget. It was all famous to us the rest of the year, and that is, remember, doesn't matter if Kennedy wins, it doesn't matter if Nixon wins, it only matters if NBC wins.
The candidates' party headquarters featured large tally boards showing minute-by-minute results. After a slow start, with Vice President Nixon seeming to be ahead, as more results came in, the momentum tipped in Kennedy's favor. His supporters were elated. However, as the evening wore on, it became clear that the election would remain too close to call throughout the night, with the candidates seesawing back and forth. Finally, by the next morning, the papers would declare John Kennedy the victor. It would be the closest election since Woodrow Wilson, and before that, Abraham Lincoln. It would take until that afternoon for Vice President Nixon to finally concede.
I want to say that one of the great features of America is that we have political contests, that they are very hard fought, as this one is hard fought, and once the decision is made, we unite behind the man who is elected. I want all of you to know, I want Senator Kennedy to know, and I want all of you to know that certainly if this trend does continue and he does become our next president, that he will have my wholehearted support and yours too.
As he would throughout his presidency, Kennedy was careful to include his family in the spotlight. Once Nixon had finally conceded, Kennedy was able to address the country and his supporters.
To all Americans, I say that the next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s. I ask your help in this effort, and I can assure you that every degree of mind and spirit that I possess will be devoted to the long-range interests of the United States and to the cause of freedom around the world. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
In what would come to be one of the closest elections in American history, Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon by 0.2% in the popular vote. It is no exaggeration to say that the 1960 presidential campaign forever transformed the landscape of American political campaigns. On the frigid morning of January 20th, 1961, on the heels of a snowstorm that had nearly shut down the entire city, John Fitzgerald Kennedy delivered what to this day is considered one of the greatest speeches in the history of the American presidency.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The second youngest president after Theodore Roosevelt, and the first one born in the 20th century, the incoming 35th president had spent the previous evening bouncing from lavish gala to lavish gala, including one thrown by one of his biggest supporters, Frank Sinatra, a party attended by the likes of Betty Davis, Laurence Olivier, Nat King Cole, Gene Kelly, and Ella Fitzgerald. On the podium, along with Kennedy's family, were the two previous presidents, Truman and Eisenhower, along with the two men who would come to hold office for the balance of the decade and into the next, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Kennedy had selected 86-year-old former poet laureate Robert Frost to deliver a poem written for the occasion. But because of the bright winter sunlight, and despite Vice President-elect Johnson's valiant effort to shield the poem with his hat, Frost was unable to see clearly enough to read, and instead recited an older poem from memory.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You have an individual who speaks with a kind of poetry. And I've said before, and everybody talks, this bold rhetoric of John Kennedy, this absolute duty to embrace challenge, the hard things to do, the difficult things to do, because we're young, because we have that energy. And Kennedy expressed that and looked like it. The image and the rhetoric were together and complemented each other perfectly. But that's the image. The thing is, John Kennedy, like so much in his life, is going to inherit many things that he wasn't particularly experienced with, but he'll have to handle them. And inheriting the presidency at the time that he inherited it, it's a perilous world that President Eisenhower had to tell him about in many ways.
I was 23 years old when President Kennedy was inaugurated. and it was the first time I had voted, because in those days you had to be 21 to vote. It was an exciting, just an electric time in our country. In retrospect, it was a real golden age, because after World War II and all the sacrifice that people had made in order to win the war, we had an enormous confidence in our country and in everything that we could accomplish. And along came this handsome young man, a next generation from those who had been the leaders in our country, gorgeous wife, and so there was a tremendous sense, and I shared in it, of possibility and of transformation in our country. It was really a magic time.
I would suspect that when most people think of John Kennedy's very short presidency, there are several moments that are iconic. And without question, the inaugural speech is one of those moments. And I suspect that most people who know very little about John Kennedy can probably quote, the "ask not what your country can do for you" phrase, yes? And the image on that cold, morning, the frost in the air, and you see all the dignitaries on the stage, and most of them are heavily wrapped up in very warm coats. And President Eisenhower, the older man, not particularly well, is really, bundled up. And here you've got John Kennedy, the president-elect, no top coat, no hat, no gloves, in the cold, frosty morning, looking very young, looking very healthy, looking very ready to go. And that image is just powerful. That image exudes so much of the bold rhetoric that will be in that speech. Lots of courage and boldness of the new frontier and new things. And his looks really advanced all of those words.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
He was always very good with bold rhetoric. Many people have identified, however, when you listen to the inaugural speech or read it, where's civil rights? Where is any kind of comment about that element? And that was just not on his radar. When Kennedy thought of race, as most people did, I suspect, at that time, the race they had most in mind is the one with communism and the competition in the world between the free world and the communist world. And that's what Kennedy spoke most about on that morning, that very iconic scene of taking the oath of office, a new generation, a new future.
The spirit of his speech rang loud and clear. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who served Kennedy as special assistant to the president, described the spirit of the first days of the Kennedy administration as being a flood of buoyant optimism, full of promise and hope. In reality, there were few significant achievements the first year of Kennedy's presidency. With the Senate controlled mostly by Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans, aside from raising the minimum wage and strengthening Social Security, few of his proposed legislation went through. He tried to compensate by using executive orders. Using the order, he created the first ever Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, as well as one of the most successful initiatives of his administration, the creation of the Peace Corps. As one of his first acts as president, on March 1, 1961, with Executive Order Number 10924, President John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps. Each program participant, a Peace Corps volunteer, would be an American citizen, typically with a college degree, who worked abroad for a period of 24 months after 3 months of training. Volunteers worked with governments, schools, nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations, and entrepreneurs in education, hunger, business, information technology, agriculture, and the environment. After 24 months of service, volunteers could either opt out or request an extension of service.
The Peace Corps is a wonderful example of the sort of new thinking of John Kennedy. Coming as a new member of the new generation, John Kennedy clearly wanted to distinguish himself from some of the propositions and practices of the World War II older generation, especially that he saw in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the people who were generally responsible for much of the military action of the United States. The Peace Corps is an excellent example of avoiding the dangers of escalation and humiliation. The idea that you could have other options to combat challenges, especially communism in the Third World, without military, without bombs, without that kind of high profile. The Peace Corps would be young, it would be volunteers, it's the young generation, they're going to be doing service, they're going to be providing vulnerable people with the abilities to combat the attractions of the communist world, teaching them how to farm, getting them running water, teaching them how to benefit themselves so they're not going to be vulnerable to the seductions of the communist rhetoric. It's absolutely perfect for John Kennedy. It's sort of a low radar. It's a new thinking. It energizes the young. It calls people into public service. And it's moderate. It's not something that raises the bar to calamity.
The organization grew to 5,000 members in 1963 and 10,000 the following year. Since 1961, over 200,000 Americans have served in the Peace Corps in more than 139 countries.
The other piece about the Peace Corps that will help John Kennedy is that so often we talk about how John Kennedy adjusted with the institutional Democratic Party, people like Eleanor Roosevelt or Truman or Hubert Humphrey. And the Peace Corps was really kind of a Humphrey initiative that John Kennedy was quite glad to co-opt and to advance in his new frontier. And I'm sure Humphrey was just fine with that.
In May 1961, after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to fly in space that April, in an attempt to restart his presidency after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy gave a second State of the Union address. Among the proposals he made was a call for achieving the goal before the decade was out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. 3 weeks after the Soviet launch, Alan Shepard became the first American astronaut to travel into space. 9 months later, on February 20th, 1962, more than 1 million people watched John Glenn's rocket take off from Cape Canaveral on its way to circling the Earth 3 times, before landing safely in the Atlantic Ocean near Bermuda.
One of the principal things, of course, that's going to define John Kennedy's presidency in this period, the Cold War period, is the challenge with communism. And it is a race. Every part of the earth is going to be a challenge and a source of competition between the free world and the communist world. And that will extend even into outer space. Who will dominate that? I mean, there's no way you can exaggerate the fear, the menace, the threat that was popularly felt at that time of somebody getting the advantage.
Again, making clear his fear of falling behind the Soviets, on June 14, 1962, Kennedy warned in a press conference that the United States could not afford to become second in space, or permit the Soviets to become dominant because of the unknown military implications. He re-emphasized this point 3 months later in September 1962 during a speech at Rice University.
Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them.
The thought that the Soviets or the communists could beat us, could establish a foothold in outer space, was not just a question of bragging rights. Or it was an issue that said, oh, the Soviets, they have a superior system. Look what they've got. Look what they can accomplish. That would be humiliating to us, and that would be humiliating to the administration. And that would never be anything John Kennedy and his administration would tolerate, to look weak, to be humiliated. There had to be strength for strength. The other element, I mean, besides just the image of it and what it would say about our relative economic political systems, was the danger. The idea that we could be targeted from outer space and we couldn't challenge that, there is no way you could tolerate that. So for a number of reasons, and all related to that Cold War conflict, John Kennedy spoke boldly about going into space. And that's another one of the most iconic images. And most people remember about the John Kennedy administration with great fondness, the space program.
Even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold. I'm the one who's doing all the work, so we just want you to stay cool for a minute. However, I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done. And it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
The costs of the space program were enormous, but Kennedy justified them by arguing that the program was essential for international prestige as well as what might be learned for military advantage. In a September 1963 speech before the United States, Kennedy again urged, as he had in his first State of the Union address, for cooperation between the Soviets and Americans in space. But as he had before, Khrushchev declined. On November 16, 1963, just 6 short days before President Kennedy would be killed in Dallas, he made his third and what would be his final visit to Cape Canaveral, the home of his beloved space program. He was warmly welcomed by NASA Administrator James Webb and given a tour and briefing of the Gemini project by astronauts Cooper and Grissom. He stopped at the base of the Saturn, the rocket charged with meeting his goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. From there, he boarded a helicopter for a 30-mile trip out to what is called Observation Island. The president was whistled aboard to watch his first missile launch. A Polaris launched from the submerged nuclear submarine, the Andrew Jackson.
A proud commander congratulated a proud crew.
The president commended the crew before returning to the Cape by helicopter.
I mean, it permeated everything, even food. I mean, you'd even have, space sticks and movies about space and TV shows about space. Very common. And that is one of John Kennedy's, I think, great legacies, is to get the United States in that race and get out there and compete with the Soviets.
On November 25th, the men and officers of the space and missile programs gathered at attention. The Cape was closed to memorialize the slain president. Brigadier General Henry J. Sams, Jr. spoke.
He moved among us with warmth and interest and awareness of our efforts. It is well to remember that we are assembled here today not because of the shocking way that he died, but because of and in tribute to the way he lived. We salute the memory of our late president, John F. Kennedy, and salute as well, in token of our steadfast devotion to duty, the new president and Commander-in-Chief, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Determined to move forward with the president's vision, the next evening a rocket platform was launched from the Cape, the space program's 21st consecutive successful launch. The next day, the Atlas Centaur launched without a hitch. On Thanksgiving Day, taking the advice of the slain president's wife Jacqueline, President Johnson issued an executive order renaming Cape Canaveral Cape Kennedy as a symbol of the United States' continuing commitment to President Kennedy's dream of a successful space program. On July 20th, 1969, almost 6 years after Kennedy's death, Apollo 11 landed the first manned space mission on the Moon. As little as 24 hours prior to his inauguration, when he was informed in a White House meeting with outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy had no knowledge of a plan already in place to overthrow Cuban dictator Fidel Castro's communist regime.
One of the jobs of president seems to always be, having to react to unanticipated or unknown obvious events, that things that happen and that you didn't see coming. And that really tests a president. It solidifies a president and says a lot about the president's character and their control of their administration. When John Kennedy became president in 1961, as everyone will tell you, he was a very inexperienced individual. And he wasn't really ready for some of these challenges that he had to face immediately. And one of those challenges, and it was a big surprise, was of course being told that there's this, operation that's been going on, and the CIA is intending to, kind of fake an invasion of Cuba by freedom-loving Cubans, and the United States is behind this. Well, John Kennedy couldn't quite pull the plug on that. He certainly couldn't tell Dwight Eisenhower he wasn't going to do that. But what could he do? I mean, he has to carry it out, but he tries to lower the noise, as he would say, make it less alarming, make it seem like it's less America. I mean, these are all, looking back on it, kind of flawed and faulty and kind of embarrassing attempts to reduce or limit the possible damage.
Eisenhower was adamant that the U.S. could not allow the regime to survive. The plan, as Eisenhower explained it, was to send armed Cuban refugees back into Cuba, equipped by the American military, supported by American air power. The goal was to undermine and eventually overthrow the Cuban regime. The Cuban émigrés were already in the process of being trained and equipped. The CIA, convinced that the Castro regime was vulnerable and that opposition forces in Cuba were gaining strength, spearheaded by its director Allen Dulles, had pushed hard for the operation. But many other members of government, including William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were skeptical. The new president, at best, was ambivalent, deciding to downgrade the action from an invasion to an infiltration, and ordering the CIA to reduce the size and scope of the operation. Taking the most cautious approach, short of canceling the operation altogether, a decision that would end up dooming the operation to failure from the very outset, Kennedy ordered that no American troops would land in Cuba, and that the air presence would be reduced to a minimum. The planes that did fly were ordered to hide American insignia on their wings and body. And indeed, as those involved in the planning and execution had predicted, a failure it was. Because of high winds and a rocky shoreline, it took 2 days for the émigrés to reach the shore. The expected uprising of anti-Castro forces from within the country was too minimal to make an impact. And on top of everything else, ammunition ships failed to reach the beaches where Castro's forces were already in place. By the second day, the mission had turned from overthrowing Castro to rescuing the émigrés. It was impossible to hide the fact that the mission was an American project, as well as the fact that Kennedy's cancellation of the airstrikes had ensured defeat. CIA Director Allen Dulles was forced to resign, and in an April 20th press conference, the president took full blame. The final humiliation came when the American government was forced to provide American farm equipment in exchange for imprisoned anti-Castro soldiers.
It was probably fortunate that the Bay of Pigs happened, if it had to happen, early in President Kennedy's administration, while there was still the immediate euphoria and enthusiasm, the honeymoon period, if you will. If that had happened later on, it would have been very damaging to his presidency. He was able to come back for it, learn some lessons from it. It certainly was a terrible blunder, but he did get past it with we could say, minimum damage, except that it's poisoned our relationships with Cuba for now over half a century.
The problem that Eisenhower was trying to contend with communism so close to our border, John Kennedy can't ignore that, and he can't let that go away. And historians will, of course, tell you of how it became kind of an obsession to the Kennedy administration, especially between John and his younger brother, the Attorney General Bobby.
The Bay of Pigs failure was only the beginning of what would become a concerted covert effort, codenamed Operation Mongoose, by Jack and his brother Bobby to destabilize and overthrow the Castro regime. In fact, just a few days before the Cuban Missile Crisis, on October 10, 1962, the U.S. obtained permission to stockpile armaments in the Bahamas for use in an imminent invasion. Some years later, in reference to the operations, Lyndon Johnson referred to what the Kennedy brothers were doing in Cuba as, quote, a goddamn murder, Inc.
The attempts Kennedy made to lower the noise and to reduce the public scrutiny on the propaganda stage for America just didn't work. And it made him look weak at the time. It's an embarrassment. But oddly enough, it was an embarrassment that the American public seemed to forgive. Because you look back at the polls and you'll see it didn't really dent him tremendously, which is quite interesting to consider how the Americans liked John Kennedy and were willing to give him a break, I suppose. But the idea that he got kind of stuck in that and that he was humiliated right off the top will certainly sour his relationship with the CIA, Allen Dulles, the leader of the CIA, and a lot of the brass in the military who loved that kind of public gung-ho, bombs away stuff. Kennedy will not like that approach, and we'll see him kind of try to go away from that approach as he moves through his administration, always trying to find a way to lower the noise, always trying to find a more moderate course, always trying to find an option, or two, or three, or four, where he could work behind the scenes, where he can make a deal.
The Bay of Pigs is an object lesson, and I think that President Kennedy took it to heart, and as a consequence, his foreign policy was more effective and thoughtful after that.
To truly understand the Bay of Pigs and the United States' relationship with Cuba, it is important to understand the origins of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement against the U.S.-supported regime of Cuban dictator Batista. The revolution began in July 1953 and finally ousted Batista on January 1, 1959. Replacing his regime with Castro's communist government. Second in command to Castro was Che Guevara, an Argentine Marxist revolutionary. Guevara would serve the regime in a wide range of capacities, from reviewing appeals for those condemned to the firing squads, all the way to starting a successful national literacy campaign. During the Castro regime's first few years, a wide range of progressive social reforms were put in place, including equality for Black Cubans, greater rights for women, and improved medical facilities, health, housing, and education. The regime formally nationalized all foreign-owned property, particularly American holdings, in August of 1960, to which the United States responded by freezing all Cuban assets on American soil, severing diplomatic ties, and tightening its embargo. In response, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union for support. In 1960, with an elaborate state-sponsored celebration, Cuba welcomed the arrival of the Soviet Deputy Premier's plane. In the month that followed, Cuba and Russia would sign economic trade agreements, and the Soviets would extend $100 million worth of credit to Castro's regime. Soon after, Che Guevara and Castro's brother Raul would travel to Russia to purchase weapons. In this 1960 May Day parade in Havana, the arms are Czech, but soon they would be Soviet. From the Kremlin, Khrushchev vowed both economic and military support for the regime.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, which so often, and certainly in its own day, seemed to be a bold victory for the John Kennedy administration, that we sort of had a stare down with the Soviets, and we won. When it came to that, we won that event. Well, looking back on it in hindsight, now you do have the ability to look and say, well, maybe John Kennedy kind of contributed to that problem when they tried to invade Cuba with the Bay of Pigs, and Castro's moves to defend his island were pretty reasonable given that reality, and that Kennedy might be part of the problem that he then had to solve later. And then you'd also bring in, of course, the fact that the United States had its own missiles, say in Turkey, aimed directly at the Soviet Union. Why would it be any different for the Cubans to have the same sort of potential? But that and many other examples are evidences of historians revisiting the story.
On October 14, 1962, when the first reconnaissance photos taken by the U-2 flight over Cuba were viewed at the White House, the conversation between the president's brother Bobby and Richard Helms, Deputy Director of Plans for the CIA, expressed both the urgency and sudden frightening reality of what the photos implied. "Dick, is it true?" exclaimed Bobby. "Dick, is it true? Did the Russians put missiles in Cuba?" "Yes," Helms replied, "it's true." Bobby's one-word exclamation seemed to say it all. Shit. The president had been skeptical that the weapons the Soviets had in Cuba were for anything but defensive purposes. But when the surveillance photos showed proof positive that the weapons were offensive, the administration was left with two choices, neither of which bode well for the prospects of a peaceful solution. They could either make a sudden, unannounced military strike on the weapons, which in all likelihood would lead to instant escalation, or they could choose to play a high-stakes game of chicken, building the crisis up to the point where hopefully the Soviets would back down. Desperate to avoid a military confrontation, along with intensive diplomatic efforts to persuade Khrushchev to back down, the president chose the blockade.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
To avoid being charged with an act of war under international law, the blockade would be called a quarantine. Kennedy explained that this would leave the Soviets with the burden of choice, giving them the option of backing down without a humiliating defeat or nuclear war. The Organization of American States voted in favor of the blockade, as well as approving the use of military power if necessary. Meanwhile, the United States began hurriedly reinforcing its base at Guantanamo Bay, its first line of defense in case of war. In Cuba, Castro made a show of strength, arming his citizens and preparing them for possible war, as well as organizing large public rallies to boost the country's morale. In heated rhetoric, Castro refused inspections of his country by the United Nations and called President Kennedy a pirate for his naval blockade. At the United Nations, the U.S. and Soviet ambassadors argued back and forth, with the U.S. holding fast to the president's position that the missiles be removed before any alternative would be discussed.
I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons.
I was in the Army at 5th Army Headquarters in Chicago, and my job was Chief of the Intelligence Branch. I would talk to all of the other Army places all over as we got ready, and I think most of those people thought we're going to war over this thing. And the spirit in the Army was very much pro-Kennedy on that issue. They loved the idea that he would say, "Get out of here. No, you don't."
The president informed Khrushchev that the quarantine would go into effect on October 24th. Once the crisis was made public, there was near panic. In the blink of an eye, America had found itself on the brink of annihilation. The possibility of nuclear war was now as close as the push of a button. Financial markets plunged in New York, London, and the European common market. The price of gold rose to a record high, and there was a run on canned food, ration packs, and bottled water to supply makeshift fallout shelters. The Soviet ships continued on toward Cuba, but had yet to breach the quarantine line, which most of Kennedy's staff believed they would. Kennedy was concerned with what the Soviets might do in Berlin in response. Early the next day, with the ships still approaching, the president feared the worst. Talk began of torpedoes and depth charges. But only a few minutes later, word came that the ships were turning around. And 2 days later, Khrushchev relented. The crisis had been averted.
Because John Kennedy had learned the lessons that he did learn from the Bay of Pigs, and with Robert Kennedy beside him, that crisis was handled superbly. And our nation dodged what could have been a horrible outcome had we done a preemptive strike on Cuba with our, and even possibly invaded Cuba.
The Cuban Missile Crisis made Nikita Khrushchev look weak. One thing that is absolutely essential to understanding Russian government, whether it's the autocracy of the czars or the premier or general secretary of the Politburo, it doesn't matter, it's the same thing. It's consistent all the way through. Russians love strength. They want to see a strong leader. They identify with that. Any hint of weakness, and you're pretty much out. The humiliation of the missile crisis for Khrushchev is going to be part of his tremendous undoing. There'll be other factors, of course, but don't minimize, don't underestimate that fact. He made the Soviet regime look weak. They had to back down, and that's not something they like to do. Soviet self-image, Russian self-image if you're a Russian kid, you come to think of Russia as a kind of the savior of the world. And you look in their history books and they'll say, see, Napoleon, who stopped him? We did. The Mongols, who stopped them? And they're going to take Europe? We did. Who stopped Hitler? We did. The impression you'll get from their perspective is one of strength and a kind of savior status. And they don't like it at all when that reputation is sullied. And among other reasons, that's one of the things Khrushchev brought to them. And there's just no way he's going to be able to pull the strength, the kind of strength he's going to need in the Politburo after the missile crisis. Even though behind the scenes, the effect of that was for Kennedy and Khrushchev, the two governments, to actually talk more and to actually reduce the tensions that brought us to the precipice of nuclear annihilation. It had that engagement had a profound effect on both individuals. The reality of nuclear holocaust, it's one thing to talk about. Saber rattling in the nuclear age is quite different, and the consequences are overwhelming, and they're immediate and irretrievable. You can't really call back those ships. And I think that effect on both Kennedy, and we see that in Kennedy with, the test ban treaty. This was a scary deal with Khrushchev's ouster. I mean, the consequences were profound.
In June 1963, in a commencement address made at the American University in Washington, D.C., President Kennedy attempted a radical shift from the traditional heated rhetoric of the Cold War, striking a previously unheard-of conciliatory note and praising the Russian people for their many advances.
In his American University speech, spoke about a different foreign policy, one that would be more a policy of détente and move us away from the Cold War attitudes that we had that had been our approach ever since World War II.
I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. 18 years ago, the event of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world, as well as the war. Since that time, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth. In an age when both sides have come to possess enough nuclear power to destroy the human race several times over, the world of communism and the world of free choice have been caught up in a vicious circle of conflicting ideology and interest. Each increase of tension has produced an increase of arms. Each increase of arms has produced an increase of tension. In these years, the United States and the Soviet Union have frequently communicated suspicion and warnings to each other, but very rarely hope. Our representatives have met at the summit and at the brink. They have met in Washington and in Moscow, in Geneva, and at the United Nations. But too often these meetings have produced only darkness, discord, or disillusion. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. For the first time, an agreement has been reached on bringing the forces of nuclear destruction under international control.
Signing the treaty, Kennedy called for the two countries to press onward in quest of what he called man's essential desire for peace.
Lyndon Johnson will inherit, and so will subsequent presidents, the legacy of this youthful, vigorous, bold rhetoric confronting worldwide challenges, and how do you do them in a nuclear age? How do you do them in a manner that reduces risk not just cost. How do you contend with an ideological world when you yourself are not an ideologue? And that's really important, because John Kennedy came into the presidency and lived as president with no particular ideology. I mean, he was very a pragmatic, practical president, reacting mostly to things he didn't expect, and judging his reactions at the time and then over time. But how do you administer the office of president, the powerful job of America in the world, and avoid ideological battles? That is a problem that Americans contend with very much today. And John Kennedy had to deal with that. And that's an interesting legacy that he bears. When you talk about the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy presidency, there are, as we've said, these iconic images that most people use to identify or define the whole presidency. The inaugural speech, right? The other huge one has to be his speech in Berlin. The enthusiasm with which the crowds received his comments, the spokesman of the free world coming to Berlin.
Moving through thriving post-war West Berlin, all at once we are confronted with a sudden, sharp contrast to the busy metropolis. A stark reminder of the city's wartime years, a monument to its years of tyranny and dictatorship. Going back to the final days of World War II, under the combined assault of the United States on one side and the Russians on the other, Hitler's Germany was defeated. When the two sides met up at the Elbe River, there were fervent toasts to peace. We see ecstatic faces of Russian prisoners of war freed by the Americans. The Nazi swastika trampled, and the genuine hope that the Allies would work together to secure a long-lasting peace. But there was work to be done. Order needed to be restored in the defeated country. With the signing of the Berlin Declaration of June 5, 1945, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia assumed supreme authority in regard to Germany. In good faith, the British and Americans agreed to pull back from the Elbe River to an agreed-upon divide. The Allies split Germany up into 4 occupation zones: French, British, American, and Russian. Berlin was left unclaimed, its fate to be decided by a future unified Germany. But since the city was within the Russian area of occupation, an agreement was necessary to allow for Western access. That same month, June 1945, an exchange of letters between President Truman and Marshal Stalin led to an arrangement of free and unimpeded access routes to Berlin. Specific roads, railways, waterways, canals, and air routes were decided upon. Willy Brandt, the West Berlin mayor who had done much for the swift economic development of the city, appealed to Western allies for protection from the Soviets. The American military presence in Berlin was minimal, with only 3 garrisons and 12,000 men, compared to 20 divisions the Soviets had surrounding the city. Though the West made a show of strength, it was more symbolic than anything real. Willy Brandt visited Washington to discuss the situation. And tried to get a feel for the new president's position.
The President expressed the continued interest of the American people and government in Berlin. He reiterated the determination of the United States, in cooperation with its allies, to preserve and maintain the freedom of the people of West Berlin, to which it is committed by treaty and conviction.
The stage for the 1961 Vienna Conference had been set the previous year in Paris, when Khrushchev stormed out of the meetings over the recent U-2 incident, threatening to sign a treaty with East Germany that would exclude the Allies from Berlin. A year later, meeting with newly elected President Kennedy in Vienna, Khrushchev repeated his claim that East Berlin was the capital of a sovereign Berlin, and again threatened to sign a treaty with East Germany to end all Western rights to Berlin. On August 13, 1961, a line of East German police created a wall in front of the Brandenburg Gate. The people of West Germany stood opposite them in loud protest, voicing their dissent. As tensions rose, the East Germans were forced to fire water cannons to disperse the crowd of protesters. As the wall went up, many East Germans made a last scramble for freedom. The defections were not limited to civilians only. Ultimately, on August 12, 1961, when the wall finally went up, Brandt was critical of what he felt was inadequate response on the part of the Western Allies and America in particular. Brick by brick, the the harsh realities and growing tensions of a city divided were now literally set in stone. When Chancellor Adenauer visited the newly constructed wall, he was met with radio truck insults and endless barbed wire. A few still managed to make their escape, mostly at night or through hastily improvised tunnels, though many would find their end at the hands of an East German bullet. Vast spaces, once a swarm of bustle and commotion, stood silent and empty. The wall would mark the end of the line for freedom. Kennedy was quick to address the nation about the sudden tensions in Berlin. As was typical of the Kennedy administration, the problem was approached from many different fronts. Along with apprising the American public of the situation, diplomacy, mostly through NATO channels, was attempted in hopes of resolving the conflict without resorting to military measures. Meanwhile, not only was the wall an economic divider, but more significantly, it divided a once united people from themselves.
President Kennedy's address to the nation has been hailed by the nation's allies as the only reply the West could give to red threats in Berlin. He spoke quietly yet firmly.
Good evening. 7 weeks ago tonight, I returned from Europe to report on my meeting with Premier Khrushchev and the others. His grim warnings about the future of the world, his aide memoir on Berlin, the subsequent speeches and threats which he and his agents have launched, and the increase in the Soviet military budget that he has announced, have all prompted a series of decisions by the administration and a series of consultations with the members of the NATO organization. The immediate threat to free men is in West Berlin, but that isolated outpost is not an isolated problem. The threat is worldwide. Our efforts must be equally wide and strong, and not be obsessed by any single manufactured crisis. We face a challenge in Berlin, but there is also a challenge in Southeast Asia, where the borders are less guarded, the enemy harder to find, and the dangers of communism less apparent to those who have so little. We face a challenge in our own hemisphere, and indeed wherever else the freedom of human beings is at stake. The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin. For the choice of peace or war is largely theirs, not ours.
Berlin was the epicenter of the Iron Curtain, only in a brick formation. Berlin represented, symbolic of the war going on, that all these people were just pawns of, inconsequential. And here's John Kennedy, the leader of the free world, connecting, identifying himself with them. I am a Berliner. Extraordinary. You talk to people who lived in Europe, East Europe, and they'll tell you, in the dinkiest little countryside home, there'd be two photographs on the wall, Jesus and John Kennedy. Now, how does that happen? That John Kennedy, the President of the United States, would have that kind of global celebrity and support, that people would feel something for an American president. That's extraordinary.
A city does not become free merely by calling it a free city. For a city or a people to be free requires that they be given the opportunity, without economic, political, or police pressure, to make their own choice and live their own lives. The people of West Berlin today have that freedom. It is the objective of our policy that they will continue to enjoy it. Peace does not come automatically from a, quote, peace treaty, unquote. There is peace in Germany today, even though the situation is abnormal. A peace treaty that adversely affects the lives and rights of millions will not bring peace with it. A peace treaty that attempts to affect adversely the solemn commitments of three great powers will not bring peace with it. We again urge the Soviet government to reconsider its course, to return to the path of constructive cooperation it so frequently states it desires, and to work with its World War II allies in concluding a just and enduring settlement of issues remaining from that conflict.
The Berlin Wall was the first wall in recorded history to keep people in and not out. Before it was erected, 3.5 million East German citizens had escaped into West Berlin. If people managed to get by the guards and their guns, there was the wall itself, which functioned as a series of defenses all rolled into one. Barbed wire on the outside, the wall itself, and then on top of the wall, set into the concrete, shards of broken glass. Over 100 people had been killed attempting to cross the border. The East German guards were ordered to shoot one another if one of them attempted to escape. Windows were sealed with bricks where attempts had been made to jump over the wall into West Berlin. The gulf between the two sections, though small physically, in effect was immeasurable. On June 26, 1963, a short distance from the wall and overlooking the east, the people of West Berlin were expecting a visitor, the President of the United States of America.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system, for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it, for it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
And the Berlin speech doesn't answer for it fully, but it certainly contributes to the reputation he enjoyed internationally. And of course, he is cognizant of that. And that's why all of the other things in his administration have to harmonize with that image. He has to be that spokesman for the free world. And all of his policies have to reflect that. He has to avoid embarrassment. He has to avoid failure. He has to avoid defeat. He cannot look weak. He has to look strong. He has to speak strong. And talking and connecting with the people reflects another way of winning the war in the hearts and minds of people that don't involve bombs, that don't involve planes, that don't involve the high risk of failure or nuclear annihilation. It's brilliant. It's perfect Kennedy.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today.
He was always very good with bold rhetoric. Many people have identified, however, when you listen to the inaugural speech or read it, where's civil rights? Where is any kind of comment about that element? And that was just not on his radar. When Kennedy thought of race, as most people did, I suspect, at that time, the race they had most in mind is the one with communism and the competition in the world between the free world and the communist world. And that's what Kennedy spoke most about on that morning.
Not until the final months of his life did civil rights become the moral imperative that he would be willing to stake his political future on. Kennedy's record as a congressman and senator was mixed. He supported Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 and mentioned civil rights in several speeches. But for the 1957 Civil Rights Act, Kennedy voted in favor of Title IV, termed the Jury Trial Amendment, which civil rights activists felt greatly weakened the act. During his 1960 presidential campaign, going against the advice of his closest aides, including his brother Bobby, when Martin Luther King was arrested in the aftermath of a sit-in at an Atlanta restaurant, Kennedy telephoned Coretta Scott King and offered to help. Within a few hours, King was released from jail. Only a few months later, though, shortly before delivering his inauguration speech, Kennedy chose to edit out a strong passage concerning civil rights in favor of something less contentious that didn't mention race.
My own perspective is that of having worked for Robert Kennedy when he was a senator, but I was very aware of what was happening in the country, the determination and courage of people, young people who sat at lunch counters protesting segregation, of the lawyers who had brought Brown v. Board of Education and succeeded, of the freedom riders who went down to the South and risked their lives, all of that. And because of the civil rights movement, JFK responded. Didn't do it so much at first. It took a couple of years before he, and urged very much by Robert Kennedy, decided to go ahead and seek legislation. And of course, what happened with the civil rights movement pushing and pushing, and the police dogs of Bull Connor in Birmingham, and children going to jail to make the point about an end to the horrific segregation, apartheid that we had in the United States.
So it's a very complicated topic. It gets involved with communism as well. I mean, the Communist Party, always wanting to make propaganda moves, would have an easy day of identifying the land of freedom, and then you look in the heart of the land of freedom and you see the sizable contingent of American citizens denied the right to vote, denied the right to travel, go down the list. It would be very hard for John Kennedy or any president to brag about freedom or to market freedom and talk about the tyranny of the communist world when you got that happening right in your backyard, and newspapers are printing pictures and stories are coming out. I mean, it was exceedingly embarrassing, and it hurt them in the foreign policy game. But the fact that communists would infiltrate civil rights movements and work from within those was also a fact that complicated Kennedy's dealings with civil rights. If you found, for example, that some of the activists in the black community had communist connections, either in the past or at the present, at the time. And that became known, what would happen? This would be a terrible catastrophe. Oh, Kennedy's soft on communism? This would be an embarrassment. And he would find it very difficult domestically to get support for measures on, you name it, housing, voting, whatever. He would lose so much support among Democrats as well as Republicans. He couldn't be identified with that. He couldn't be partnered with, communists. And that was an issue that was really troubling. And it troubled them to the point where they even, worked with J. Edgar Hoover carefully to wiretap, and to conduct surveillance on members of the civil rights community. Martin Luther King's attorney, people within Martin Luther King's immediate inner circle, Martin Luther King himself wiretapped. And this was all done with the knowledge of John Kennedy, with his permission. His younger brother, as Attorney General, working with J. Edgar Hoover, did this regularly, routinely. And they found out information they didn't really want to know.
During his first year as president, Kennedy believed that there was not enough support in Congress for a civil rights bill. Not wanting to jeopardize what legislation he did propose, his major concern was not alienating the Southern Democrats, who held key seats on several important foreign policy committees. He also resisted meeting Martin Luther King Jr., in part because of his concern about Southern Democrats, but also, no less significantly, because of the administration's unease with what he perceived as a sizable communist element within King's movement. King finally said that he would never again request an appointment with the president personally, despite a campaign promise to issue an executive order banning housing discrimination as soon as he took office. Kennedy waited until after the 1962 midterm elections to do so, in the end restricting the law to cover only public housing and homes financed by government-guaranteed loans. In May 1961, when a group of freedom fighters in Alabama was attacked and beaten by local white men, the president's first reaction was annoyance. He was more concerned about what he called this goddamn civil rights mess, and how it might hurt his ability to work with Southerners in Congress and damage the United States image abroad, in particular with the Soviets, who could use it to demonstrate the hypocrisy of the U.S. fighting for freedom abroad while failing to ensure it at home. In commentating about the incident, Bobby wondered if the freedom riders had the best interest of the country at heart. It took 5 days for the president to make his first remark, a rebuke of both sides, saying that he hoped the participants would refrain from any action that might provoke further outbreaks. Less than a week later, while giving his second State of the Union address, no mention was made of the events in Alabama or civil rights. The Old Miss Riot of 1962 was fought between Southern segregationalist civilians and the federal and state authorities over the admission of James Meredith, a black student, into the University of Mississippi. The blockade was supported by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett and sparked riots on the Oxford campus. President Kennedy had hoped to use legal measures to quiet the situation, but was eventually forced to send in military police and the National Guard.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Nearly 6,000 troops patrol Oxford to maintain order, and arrests mount to more than 200 as smaller disturbances erupt the next day. Former Major General Edwin Walker, who came here from his home in Texas, is put under arrest and held in high bail on charges of inciting insurrection. He was flown to a federal prison hospital as relative calm settled on the town in the greatest crisis the South has faced since the Civil War.
Though Kennedy had designated civil rights advisors, he usually ignored them. He avoided the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, acknowledging it only by recorded message, instead going sailing.
I take great pleasure in greeting you on this centennial commemoration of one of the most solemn moments in American history. 100 years ago today, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He thereby began the process which brought a final end to the evil of human slavery, which wiped out from our nation what John Quincy Adams called the great stain upon the North American Union. But the Emancipation Proclamation was not an end. It was a beginning.
At a White House reception marking Lincoln's birthday, because of the number of African Americans attending, likely the largest group ever admitted to the White House, guests were greeted at an entrance away from photographers. At the sight of Sammy Davis Jr. in attendance with his wife Mary Britt, who was Swedish and white, the president urged an aide to get them out of here. Jackie was so appalled by her husband's behavior, she left the reception in tears.
It was a source of great embarrassment to him, something he never liked. It was something that pressured him, which he didn't like to be. It's something that made a lot of noise, which John Kennedy never liked when it comes to dealing with things. All of the reasons, in other words, politically and personally, John Kennedy would operate against it. But it was an issue that wouldn't go away. And it wouldn't go away, and it got worse and escalated, in part because of the timidity or the caution with which John Kennedy tried to handle this.
It took Alabama Governor George Wallace blocking the doorway of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa to stop two African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from attending school for John F. Kennedy to finally find the moral impulse within himself to push ahead civil rights legislation. On the evening of June 11, 1963, with no prepared speech and a half-finished script, Kennedy went on television. He spoke for 18 minutes, most of it spontaneous. During the speech, he proposed legislation that would require the end of segregation in almost all areas of American life.
Fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind, as Justice Harlan said at the turn of the century. This is what we're talking about, and this is a matter which concerns this country and what it stands for. And in meeting it, I ask the support of all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
I went to work in the Justice Department in the fall of 1963, when I had finished clerking for Arthur Goldberg, who was a justice on the Supreme Court. And I had a tremendous sense of joining an effort that was historic in our country. The Justice Department with Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, everything that by then had developed about civil rights and many of the other subjects that the Justice Department was involved in. So I had a tremendous sense of the country moving ahead and making historic changes, and that I would be a part of it.
There was just a fundamental misunderstanding here between John Kennedy and not just Martin Luther King, but all of the elements of the civil rights struggle. Kennedy never really understood, until the very end perhaps, the passion that was the force behind civil rights, the passion of it. And on the other hand, people like Martin Luther King and others never understood the politics of civil rights. And that fundamental misunderstanding complicated the ability of civil rights activists and members of the Kennedy administration of formulating a coherent policy about it. That's one of the other elements that I think really defines this.
The March on Washington on August 28, 1963, was one of the largest political rallies in the history of the United States. 2,000 buses, 21 special trains, and 10 airplanes had been chartered for the occasion, and it is estimated that as many as 300,000 people were in attendance. Over 500 cameramen, technicians, and correspondents from the major networks covered the event. Organized by a combined effort of religious, labor, and civil rights leaders, the group included Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, the vice president of the AFL-CIO, A. Philip Randolph, who originated the idea of a march all the way back in 1941 during the Roosevelt administration, and the head of the Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther. The theme of the march was jobs and freedom. The march was held on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and along with the efforts of John Kennedy, is widely credited with helping to push through important civil rights and voting rights legislation in the coming years. Beginning at the Washington Monument and ending at the Lincoln Memorial, the march was most famous for its iconic speeches and music, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which was carried live by several television stations.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
At the end of the day, Kennedy would welcome the leaders of the march in his office at the White House.
So many things happened under John Kennedy when he was president that laid the groundwork for other things that came afterward. Certainly the civil rights legislation that John Kennedy proposed in 1963 that became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Another area very tied to civil rights, because if you don't have the money to sit at a lunch counter and pay for the meal, the fact that you have the right to sit there isn't worth very much. And so under President Kennedy, the planning started for what became the War on Poverty, and specifically Robert Kennedy was at the heart of that. He hired his high school friend David Hackett to sit right in an office right next to him in the Justice Department that opened into Robert Kennedy's office. That's how important it was to the thinking of both President and Attorney General, both President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy. And so the meetings went on starting in 1961. Both people in the government and experts brought in from around the country, and thinking about what would an initiative be, especially to help young people getting into the labor market. How would that be configured? And that work that took place in Robert Kennedy's Justice Department office laid the groundwork for the War on Poverty, and Lyndon Johnson picked up on that. The country didn't understand about Lyndon Johnson because he was a Southerner and he was connected to big oil, that he also cared a great deal about civil rights and poverty, having grown up in poverty himself. And so President Kennedy laid the groundwork, opened the pathway, and the result was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which we call the War on Poverty.
I think by the end of his short time as president, as he said in that very famous speech, it became kind of he understood the moral issue involved here. And that was a bold step for him. And I think it is interesting to wonder, had Kennedy lived, had Kennedy been reelected, and those are, not certainties about reelection, what would he have done? How would that have looked? It's hard to say. I mean, it's clear, that the civil rights bill that he sent to Congress was pretty stalled, wasn't going anywhere rather, in any time soon. And the fact that his martyrdom, his death, did more to push that than his life did. It's so difficult to say. I mean, when Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation and the Congress, and he used those words that were so perfect and calculated to say, "Let us continue," that was brilliant. I mean, what Johnson did as a master politician was to adorn his policies in the cloak of John Kennedy, and that proved to be very persuasive. Who would vote against the wishes of a martyred president in the period of the grief? I mean, Johnson moved on that quickly. So Kennedy's death, tragic, brutal, horrific, had a profound beneficial effect, certainly on many things, but I think first and foremost on civil rights. And maybe in an ironic way, that's the way that whole civil rights movement was furthered, by the blood of martyrs.
And then when President Kennedy was assassinated, it turns out that it was fortunate that Lyndon Johnson had been chosen to be vice president and became president. His presidency was hugely, hugely injured by getting so deeply into Vietnam. But on civil rights, he proved himself to be deeply committed. And the result of his becoming president and the master of the Senate and the Congress that he was, that it produced the historic progress in civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, voting rights in 65, fair housing in 1968. And John Kennedy really did start that in motion by asking in early 1963 that Congress act and start the process of enacting historic legislation.
Ultimately, it took Kennedy's death and the political savvy of Lyndon Johnson to finally bring civil rights and voting rights legislation to fruition. With it, like the men Kennedy himself had celebrated in his book, Profiles in Courage, John F. Kennedy joined the ranks of those who had the courage to put moral imperative, and in this case, the greater good of the country, ahead of themselves.
Today, the communists reach ruthlessly for domination over Southeast Asia and are trying to break our will to foil the attempt.
The use which the communists make of democracy, and then when they seize power, the effectiveness with which they manage the police apparatus so that dissent cannot arise, and so that the people can no longer express their will, the liquidation by gunfire of the opposition or by forcing them out of the country to be refugees. This suggests the kind of problem which we're going to have in this decade. And in my judgment, it's an extremely difficult matter for the free nations to deal with. But I must say that it's a matter to which we must address all of our energy and all of our attention.
Almost all modern presidents, certainly in the 20th century, will define their presidency on the stage of foreign policy. That is the place where the president is president. It's not to say that they denigrate domestic issues at all, but they do tend to delegate those to, cabinet officials. Foreign policy is really the realm of the president. And John Kennedy certainly felt that and acted on that. And when he looked at the stage, the foreign stage, the clear and obvious challenge is the one that had been challenging ever since the Russian Revolution, and that's dealing with communism, the Cold War. And that's going to be particularly complicated after World War II, the experiences of World War II, but you've got nuclear weaponry now, and the prospects of annihilation, and the prospects of trying to not be vulnerable and to look weak, and the challenge of always looking strong and meeting challenge wherever it represents itself, anywhere in the globe. Kennedy will rise to that. He has to and wants to. He wants to show his administration as a very strong anti-communist force. But how do you do that? One of the things he's going to try to avoid is the inheritance of the previous administrations, where you get this sort of more bang for the buck, massive retaliation, bombing idea. Force. You confront force with force. Well, yes, that's true to some extent, but in the nuclear age, that leaves you in places that you might not want to be. Not just the practical thing of exchanging bombs for bombs, but when you start dealing with that level of challenge, you put yourself in a position of, again, being humiliated and looking weak if you back down, or escalating to the point where then what happens? The worst possible thing. So for John Kennedy, accepting some of the premise of the former administrations, of containing communism, of keeping them at bay, but yet trying to find new ways of doing that, Kennedy will distinguish himself.
We strongly and unreservedly support the goal of a neutral and independent Laos, tied to no outside power or group of powers, threatening no one, and free from any domination. We are faced with a clear and one-sided threat of a change in the internationally agreed position of Laos. This threat runs counter to the will of the Laotian people, who wish only to be independent and neutral. It is posed rather by the military operations of internal dissident elements directed from outside the country. This is what must end if peace is to be achieved in Southeast Asia. We are earnestly in favor of constructive negotiation among the nations concerned and among the leaders of Laos, which can help Laos back to the pathway of independence and genuine neutrality.
Charles de Gaulle, recalling France's failed effort in Indochina, warned Kennedy that intervention in the area could become an endless entanglement. Kennedy confided to his aides that if there was going to be a fight in Southeast Asia, that it should be in Vietnam. Kennedy tried in vain to solve the problem of Laos with clandestine CIA operations, diplomatic efforts in Washington and Moscow, and constant, though reluctant, willingness to use military force. In November of 1961, Kennedy sent General Maxwell Taylor to assess the strength of the Vietnamese military. Taylor reported to Kennedy that South Vietnam was in serious trouble, but if the U.S. took up the challenge, a victory could be had without a U.S. takeover of the war. Back in Washington, many people, including Undersecretary of State George Ball, disagreed. Bell believed that within 5 years, they'd have 300,000 men involved in the conflict. Taylor pushed back, reassuring Kennedy that the fall of Saigon to communism would lead to a rapid extension of communist control, and that the strategic implications worldwide were extremely serious. North Vietnam held exuberant demonstrations celebrating the destruction of South Vietnamese towns and villages. In retaliation, South Vietnam began using images provided by U.S. reconnaissance flights. The photos were sent to Saigon for analysis and provided detailed information on North Vietnamese troop movement and specific weaponry, some of which was clearly provided by the Soviets.
Yes, he does believe in the domino theory. Who didn't? You know, if communism spreads to one place, it will spread to the next place, and it's like a contagious thing. So you do have to stop that. But how? Kennedy will look for options that reduce not just costs, but risks. And in Southeast Asia, just like with Cuba, he will encounter that right away. Only his initial challenge will be in Laos. But the real long-term challenge is going to be the one the French encountered in Indochina and Vietnam. And Indochina is, of course, like many parts of the world at that time, reeling from its own post-war problems, wanting independence, and who will help them get their independence. And they're willing to go wherever they get help. If the communist world will help them, they'll go there. If the free world will help them, they'll go there. It doesn't really matter. People like Ho Chi Minh are willing to play the game to the best of their ability, so long as they prevail. John Kennedy has a real challenge in Southeast Asia. How do I reinforce all of the energies of freedom and keep that out of the communist category?
We faced an extremely serious and intensified struggle with the communists, whom we've talked about and read stories of 7,000 to 15,000 guerrillas operating in Vietnam, killing 2,000 civil officers a year, 2,000 police officers a year, 4,000. Now, there's been an election in Vietnam in which 75% of the people, or 80%, endorse the government. And yet we read how Vietnam is in danger because of guerrilla operations carried on by this small, well-disciplined, well-supplied, across-the-border group of guerrillas.
Well, he's going to find a mate in the president of South Vietnam, in Diem, and he will try to work with him. But Diem's a pretty tough partner. And he's very resistant to so many things that the Kennedy administration wants him to do. The truth of the matter is, Diem isn't really our puppet. I think Diem would look at the United States as his puppet. And he would make demands routinely that we find very difficult to satisfy. We have to work with that president, however. We have to work in South Vietnam to keep it from falling into the communist camp. So Kennedy will do things like following what he called a flexible response, which he inherited from this guy named Maxwell Taylor that he really enjoyed, a very scholarly general with different ideas, new ideas, different approaches. And flexible response in a kind of way is like a Peace Corps operation, in that you're going to work in the countryside, you're going to work among the indigenous people, you're going to distance them, relocate them from the vulnerable appeal and propaganda of communists in South Vietnam. You're literally going to kind of put them in kind of walled communities and safeguard them from propaganda. That's perfect Kennedy type thing. It doesn't involve bombs. It obviously involves some level of military, but not much. You're emphasizing winning the hearts and minds. You're going to win that war in an alternate way that doesn't put you in the place of escalation or humiliation. And that's perfect Kennedy. The problem is the patience that's going to require, and knowing the enemy, what attempts and what energies the enemy will bring to that game, in this case the South Vietnamese communists or the Viet Cong. And they will be far more energetic and far more persevering than Kennedy ever imagined.
Flexible response was a key element in Kennedy's attempt to distance his administration from the more dogmatic, heavy-handed approach of the previous administration. It also went against the recommendation of a more aggressive approach favored by the military establishment. In South Vietnam, where the United States was backing no DDM against the Viet Cong, this more flexible strategy was exemplified by Kennedy's decision to implement and build strategic hamlets, an attempt to isolate the citizenry of South Vietnam into what, in effect, were gated communities, designed to shield the population from the influence of the Viet Cong. Though the effort failed, it illustrated Kennedy's attempt to approach problems from more than one angle. By the end of 1961, under mounting pressure to take action, Kennedy agreed to Operation Ranch Hand, whose purpose was to use chemical defoliants, including Agent Orange, to destroy the Viet Cong's sanctuaries and food supplies. A month later, in January 1962, Kennedy signed a national security memorandum authorizing active combat activities by some American soldiers, referred to as advisors, in Vietnam.
On the occasion of your New Year's celebration, my fellow Americans and I extend our very best wishes for the prosperity and well-being of the government and the people of Vietnam. In your struggle against aggressive forces of communism, the sacrifices that you have willingly made, the courage you have shown, the burdens you have endured, have been a source of inspiration to people all over the world. Let me assure you of our continued assistance in the development of your capabilities to maintain your freedom and to defeat those who wish to destroy that freedom.
U.S. soldiers manned helicopters and attacked Viet Cong guerrillas from the air without any significant loss. The operation was so successful that the planning began for the withdrawal of troops starting in July of that year, with a schedule that would remove all American forces by the spring of 1964. But with the withdrawals being postponed time and time again, the White House began growing pessimistic. When Kennedy wanted answers to why the withdrawal was constantly being delayed, the answer was always the same: not enough equipment and poor training of the Vietnamese army. Signaling a likely increase in U.S. involvement, Undersecretary of State George Ball, in a 1962 speech, argued the necessity of increasing U.S. efforts in training, logistics, and the transportation of Vietnam forces.
You know, I think it's also really critical to always keep in mind that, you know, when we talk about what's happening on the ground with Kennedy's actions or policies, wherever they are in the world, whether they be Cuba, Berlin, or South Vietnam, there's kind of a two-front war going on. I mean, the one that's happening and the one that's being portrayed in the press. And what, you know, you have to always keep uppermost in mind, because Kennedy did, was how all of this played in the communist press. I mean, this is a war, it's the Cold War. It's a war of propaganda. It's a war of images. It's a war of perception. And anything that is in the American press, or a picture of a German shepherd biting a little black kid, a photograph of a Buddhist monk burning himself in protest against the regime supported by John Kennedy. I mean, that's going to cause problems on multiple levels, but one of them, and a big one, was the propaganda war. I mean, those pictures would be plastered all over Pravda, and Khrushchev or whoever could just say, look, this is the free world. You want that? That's freedom? Burning monks, policies that cause the people to kill themselves, or police dogs on little children, their citizens. That was humiliating to Kennedy. It was absolutely embarrassing on the propaganda front. But it would also weaken him on the political front. So a person who understands the substance of style as clearly as John Kennedy could not abide any of this, and would work tirelessly behind the scenes through channels he could open up to rectify this. And in Southeast Asia, I mean, that's going to be an important challenge to get around, because his partner there, President Diem, a fellow Catholic, is resistant to John Kennedy's pressure. But how do you get him to change? You know, when nothing seems to work, do you finally just sort of say, I'm going to start withdrawing my forces?
In Kennedy's last speech on November 14, 1963, he responded sharply to a question about congressional efforts to reduce foreign aid, saying that he couldn't believe that the Congress of the United States was going to be so unwise as to give up Vietnam. At the same time, he was still hopeful that U.S. troops could be withdrawn from Vietnam, and though troop levels continued to increase each year of his administration, he frequently rejected the military's request for even more troops, and an escalation of the war.
And, in 1963, John Kennedy does sign an executive order which suggests that some troops are going to come back. People have made a lot about what that meant now, thinking that John Kennedy was going to withdraw from South Vietnam, that if he had lived, if he had, been reelected, that he was going to take us out of there, and then we would have been spared the horrendous war of Vietnam in the 60s. But that's really funny speculation. There's no question that John Kennedy was committed in Southeast Asia, and he said so just days before his assassination when he's talking to Walter Cronkite, or even multiple interviews with his brother Bobby afterwards, that we were committed there. We're not going to abandon South Vietnam. Kennedy is not going to allow South Vietnam to fall to the communists. That would be bad for South Vietnam, and it would really be bad for John Kennedy's administration. And they're both of the one and the same thing.
This country, therefore, continues to require the best defense in the world, a defense which is suited to the 60s. This means, unfortunately, a rising defense budget, for there is no substitute for adequate defense, and no bargain basement way of achieving it. It means the expenditure of more than $15 billion this year on nuclear weapon systems alone, a sum which is about equal to the combined defense budgets of our European allies. But it also means improved air and missile defenses, improved civil defense, a strengthened anti-guerrilla capacity, and of prime importance, more powerful and flexible non-nuclear forces. For threats of massive retaliation may not deter piecemeal aggression, and a line of destroyers in a quarantine or a division of well-equipped men on a border may be more useful to our real security than the multiplication of awesome weapons beyond all rational need. It makes little sense for us to assail, in speeches and resolutions, the horrors of communism, to spend $50 billion a year to prevent its military advance, and then to begrudge spending largely on American products, less than 1/10 of that amount, to help other nations strengthen their independence and cure the social chaos in which communism has always thrived.
The president, again, as we've said, is defined by his foreign policy, and that would have been terrible. And he's simply not going to permit that to occur. The fact that Diem is going to be assassinated just weeks before Kennedy, and largely at the allowance of John Kennedy. Not to say that he told anyone to do it or ordered it, he certainly did not. But he certainly communicated through his ambassador there, Henry Cabot Lodge, a level of impatience with Diem, and the willingness to turn the other way for a moment, signaled enough for the generals to eliminate Diem. And that was a tremendously embarrassing and problematic development, which Kennedy didn't really have to deal with too much because of his tragic end shortly thereafter. But Lyndon Johnson will have to pick up the slack on that.
The seemingly contradictory pattern of working for peace but preparing for war would be a common thread through Kennedy's presidency. Just months after taking office, he initiated the largest and most rapid defense buildup in the United States peacetime history. While 6 months later, he would create the first full-scale, full-time disarmament agency in the world. This delicate balance would play a dramatic role in Kennedy's management of both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the continuing conflict in Southeast Asia. It would also do much to color the administration's plan of action concerning nuclear weapons. Whatever the truth of Kennedy's future intentions in Southeast Asia may have been, ultimately it was a moot point. With Lyndon Johnson assuming the office of president, the United States' involvement in the war in Vietnam began in earnest. Sophisticated, cosmopolitan, worldly, elegant, and beautiful, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy transformed the image of a First Lady and quickly became an essential part of the political life and image that was John F. Kennedy.
Most people today, when they consider politicians, tend to see politicians in a wider context. What I mean is they're not just voting for this person. Very often they want to see this person in context of family, roots, wife and kids. And I'm not going to say or suggest that that is a legacy John Kennedy started, but there is no question that in John Kennedy's career, whatever course it would take, but certainly in politics, one of the elements that was just absolutely critical and essential was his marriage to Jacqueline. The image of that young couple was was everywhere. I mean, every magazine, every TV. I mean, this is on air all the time. She was beautiful. She was elegant. She was intelligent. A perfect partner to John Kennedy. And what he looked like: young, smart, from an elegant background. I mean, they were a perfect match of young America, elegant America, that people really took to.
Pleasure to have you here, and I want you to meet my daughter Caroline and my wife Jackie.
How do you do? I'm glad you had a chance to see something of the Senate, and now to see our house where we've lived a year, and since Caroline was born. And I look forward to meeting all of you this fall as soon as the Senate is out, and we'll be back in Massachusetts.
But things were not all they appear. Along with her husband regularly stepping outside the marriage, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy experienced many personal tragedies. In 1956, Jackie had a miscarriage, and then only a year later gave birth to a stillborn. In 1963, just 3 months before her husband's death, she gave birth to a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who died just 2 days after being delivered by an emergency C-section.
Americans at that time weren't particularly known for other languages, which is much more common nowadays. And somebody who could speak another language there was kind of a cachet to that. And somebody in politics speaking another language was really kind of unusual. And those are those little intangibles that today would be missed, but at that time were very conspicuous and only enhanced the image and elevated their status.
Que no hay esposa, ni madre, ni padre, ni familia en este continente que pueda conformarse hasta que los habitantes de todos nuestros pueblos tengan oportunidades de trabajo bien remunerados, pueden vivir decentemente y recibir enseñanza. Estas cosas deberían estar al alcance de todos y no limitarse a unos pocos afortunados.
And campaign trails, when John Kennedy would, share the stage with Jackie and she'd come on stage, everything got even better. I mean, it wasn't a diminution at all. She was part of the team. And if she spoke Spanish, even better, or French. I mean, John Kennedy brought her along with good reason. She was a very helpful person for his political career.
Jacqueline had a huge influence on the fashion and tastes of the early 1960s, and she and Jack, along with the 2 children, Caroline and John Jr., became a popular feature of magazine photo spreads. In 1962, when Jackie decided to redecorate the White House to better reflect her taste, she gave a televised tour of the remodel. The tour was considered must-watch television, and later that year won her an Emmy Award.
There are many historians today that tell you that if John Kennedy had lived and had run and won his re-election bid in 1964 for presidency, he might have been in a wheelchair. That is shocking to most people. They don't have much idea about how the image of John Kennedy, of him being robust and energetic and healthy, and anybody who lived during the 1960s would tell you they remember all those photographs of a healthy John Kennedy playing football, John Kennedy lifting his son, John Jr. Of course, we now know so many things about that were then kept very secret. This is a young man through all of his life really dealt with physical issues and health problems. And those things were all very secret. And quite frankly, the public wasn't particularly nosy about many of those things. And certainly the journalists at the time wouldn't be too concerned about that. There was a kind of ethic among journalists to not pry into some of these areas. Let's say if John Kennedy were running for office today, and we knew half of the things we know about his health, his reliance on prescription drugs or non-prescription drugs, the fact that he suffered from Addison's disease, which is a potentially fatal disease, it would have been very difficult for John Kennedy to run for president. Those health issues alone would have been a very big impediment. But at the time, those were not known. And many of the things that made him look young and vibrant were in fact side effects of the massive amount of daily injections he received for the multiple problems that affected his physical well-being. You know, it's even argued, of course, that even that tragic day in Dallas, that had he not been wearing the back brace, you know, it's possible, you know, and these are all just speculations, but it's possible that, you know, after being hit with the first bullet, he could have fallen. But the fact that the back brace kind of kept him up, kept him in the line of fire of the assassin. If somebody were loose or not careful or reckless in their private life, they would be setting themselves up for a tremendous surprise. And this is an area of John Kennedy's life which did compromise is the right word, to compromise so much of his actions because there was so much he had done that J. Edgar Hoover knew about and other people knew about, and mafia people knew about, and their connections in other, you know, circles. And if that word got out, I mean, they had to hide stuff. And Kennedy's youthful, promiscuous ways, I mean, one historian said that Kennedy was more promiscuous with drugs than he was with women. And that's a profound statement when you consider how promiscuous he was with women. The fact that he would have affairs with foreign women and the suggestion that those might be communist plants and information might be got, or they'd just be used to embarrass John Kennedy. He had to be leashed in on many occasions because of the recklessness of his personal life. John Kennedy kept his affairs all throughout his presidency. Jackie Kennedy was his wife. Jackie Kennedy was the mother of his children. Jackie Kennedy was part of the whole Camelot image that America loved. And that's what America wanted to know about. But the boys' club that went on, whether it be with the Rat Pack and his associations with Frank Sinatra, and this is a side of John Kennedy's life that wasn't known at the time and wouldn't have been reported on at the time, but is widely known today. It's unavoidable when you think about John Kennedy as a person, and then John Kennedy as a person and as a politician. You have to factor in his cognizance, his awareness of his mortality, And maybe that played into, and I don't be a psychohistorian here, but the recklessness with which he lived, the bravado with which he lived, the urgency with which he lived, that all fed into that.
In Texas and the nation, change has been the law of life. Growth has meant new opportunities for this state. Progress has meant new achievements. And we dare not look back now. In 1990, the age of space will be entering its second phase. And our hopes in it to preserve the peace, to make sure that in this great new sea, as on earth, the United States is second to none. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions, the Bible tells us. And where there is no vision, the people perish.
When people nowadays look back on the presidency of John Kennedy, the way he died is just so horrific, so tragic for anybody but the United States president to be murdered in broad daylight in Texas. And the consequences of that. I remember as a kid in school, everybody sent home and everybody's crying, and it was unbelievable. But, why was Kennedy even there? And the truth of the matter is that, he was campaigning. He's going to be running for re-election. And the Democratic Party was not all that unified. And Texas is a big state. Texas is a big Democratic state, or it was then. And it has a lot of electoral votes. And it was important and it's vital for Kennedy to shore up his base, his support in the South and in Texas. And the relationship between Texas Democrats was not very warm. So for multiple important and pressing political reasons, John Kennedy was going to travel south and go to Texas and deliver some key speeches, but also working behind the scenes to, get people together in the party to support him for his re-election bid. And that's the circumstances that will bring him, unbeknownst, of course, into Dealey Plaza on his way to make a speech and to be assassinated, allegedly by Lee Harvey Oswald. And again, we'll never know ultimately that, I suppose, either, because of Oswald's subsequent killing, a couple days later by Jack Ruby, never standing trial, and never really having a courtroom evidence hearing about that.
Now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please. Parkland Hospital, there has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. The president's car is now going past me. The limousine is now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service men standing up in the limousine. They are armed with submachine guns. It appears as though someone in the limousine might have been hit by the gunfire. Put me on, Phil. Put me on. Phil, am I on? We're here at the trademark. The motorcade is coming by here. I can see many motorcycles coming by now. Police motorcycles. Just heard a call on the radio for all units along Industrial to pick up the motorcade. Something has happened here. We understand there has been a shooting. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle over the top of the car. We understand Governor and Mrs. Connolly are in the car with President and Mrs. Kennedy. We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. I'm in behind the motorcade, trying to follow them. It looks as though they're going to Parkland Hospital. We're on the road to Parkland at this time. The Secret Service man is still spread eagle over whoever is in the car, the President and Mrs. Kennedy, and as we understand, Governor and Mrs. Connolly. At this point, it looks as though it could have been one or two or even all of the people within the car may have been the victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know. Parkland Hospital in the distance, all on Harry Hines Boulevard, following behind the motorcade. Many police officers, maybe 20 or 25 motorcycle policemen, falling in behind at trademark. A huge car left behind, waiting expectantly to see the president. The motorcade now perhaps 2 or 3 blocks ahead of me. They're approaching the entrance now to Parkland Hospital, traveling at a high rate of speed. Already police cars converging on Parkland from every angle, from every point. I'm pulling in now toward Parkland Hospital, coming to the approach. There's an officer waving me down. He's waving me around. There's a cordon. There's already a cordon of police officers running from their cars, from their vehicles here. The official party, as I can see it, pulling around toward the emergency room of Parkland Hospital. The policeman says, no, you cannot come in here. You cannot come in here. We'll let nobody else in. It was definitely the president's car. We could see the First Lady's paint suit. That's the only identification we could see, but we know it is the president's car. Another car directly behind the presidential car. There were also bodies in that car. Another Secret Service man, spread eagle over them. We don't know. Perhaps there was some hit in that car as well. We're not sure.
And the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital and KBOX News Director Bill Hampton.
The President of the United States is dead. I have just talked to Father Oscar Hubert of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. He and another priest tell me that the pair of men have just administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
When the president was shot, it seemed almost like the Army didn't know what to do, or matter of fact, nobody knew what to do exactly. And I don't think there was that much of a feeling of danger than there was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I suppose that's understandable, but wow, it just didn't seem like we were able to do anything but stand there and watch and get troops ready in Washington for formal ceremonial kinds of things.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God.
It was a very just incredible how profound it was. I was talking to a couple similarly aged folks today about the Kennedy time, and I postulated that it's possible even 9/11 in some ways didn't have as profound an impact as as the assassination did. I'm not sure I can explain that particularly, but it really was so just like nobody, almost impossible to believe.
We are bound to feel shattered and helpless in the face of our loss. This is but natural, but as the first bitter pangs of our incredulous grief begins to pass, we must thank God that we were privileged, however briefly, to have had this great man for our president. For he has now taken his place among the great figures of world history.
In today's world where violence is seemingly, rampant and movies are full of gore, it's difficult to, again, go back and understand how horrific the events of November 22nd really were. And the filming, Zapruder's film of the murder of John Kennedy, or of anybody for that matter, in broad daylight, and such a horrible murder, was so repulsive and so gory and really almost obscene. You wouldn't look at that kind of thing. And when Life magazine even showed some of the still photos, they kept the real graphic ones out. Why would you show that kind of stuff? I mean, the public wasn't ready for that then. It was a horrific death, and it was a martyrdom. It was a tragic end to a very short presidency, full of event. Obviously, that is going to affect the way people saw John Kennedy's presidency. And without question, in the first years after his death, all of those historical polls or salon games, he was rated high in the top 5. That is no longer the case. There's been a much closer and cooler consideration of John Kennedy's presidency.
John F. Kennedy remains perhaps the greatest symbol that we have in the history of our country of a young president who takes office at a time when the torch is passing to a new generation, as he said. The people who would have been elected in the New Deal and throughout World War II were from an older generation. And the legacy of John Kennedy is really one of vigor, as he used to say, vigor and energy and idealism and commitment to a better America, to a better opportunity for people who were excluded, especially people of color, to better opportunity for people who living in poverty. There's much more to the Kennedy legacy, for sure.
Some things still under close scrutiny still stand up, and I think in those areas you look, say, at the space program. I think that still remains sort of unsullied and a great testimony to John Kennedy's bold rhetoric.
One thing about John Kennedy, because his time was cut so short and he was only a president for less than 3 years, is the concrete results didn't happen that would have happened. And so what he gets credit for concretely is having started so many things that then happened down the road. But I think we remember him most for the sense of idealism, for the sense of the possible, what we can be, fulfilling the American dream through that sort of leadership and that sort of energy. I think that's the greatest part of his legacy.